You've heard some of the reasons why we should not give the Fourth Estate Award to Jim Perry. Now I want to tell you why the Board of Governors of the National Press Club...
Just a minute.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Just a bloody minute here. I've had enough about this gibberish, about this Perry fellow, all this colonial claptrap. Pardon me there, Mr. Colonial, sir. I am here on behalf of my fellow generals and myself to protest the slander by this fellow, this Benedict Arnold James Perry, the author of the book, Arrogant Armies, Great Military Disasters, and the generals behind them. Well, I deny that I, Major General Edward Braddock, am arrogant. The simple fact is that I am the greatest British general ever to get wiped out in the French and Indian Wars. Your Mr. Perry mocks me because I set my troops into battle. I led my troops into battle, into the woods, marching in a straight line with bright red coats and little signs that said, "Shoot me." Well, at the Royal Academy, we were taught it is better to look good than to fight good. Besides, what did you expect us to do? Hide behind killer trees? Now, I must say, as I look around at the chaps in this room tonight, that you Americans have a lot of gall to complain about us all wearing the same color uniforms. I mean, I wasn't sure if I was at the Perry dinner or the sequel to Men in Black. Besides, who is this Perry fellow to criticize me? To be called arrogant by James Perry is like being accused of having a foot fetish by Dick Morris. It's like being told to get off the phone by Al Gore. I mean, this is the fellow who, after leaving his hometown of Elmira, New York, wrote a story for the Wall Street Journal with the headline, "Elmira will never be the same." And as for his military credentials, well, the only combat he saw was behind the typewriter for Leatherneck magazine. I mean, the only reason he joined the service in the first place was that he saw a recruiting poster that said the Marines are looking for a few good curmudgeons. And I hardly think that this fellow can be honored as a serious journalist. Why, just this year he wrote an article that focused a lot on this black Labrador dog named Prince. I mean, he gave this so much national publicity, he is now referred to as the dog formerly known as Prince. And as for being a great political reporter, I mean, this must be in the great American tradition that all politics is loco. Consider, for example, this 1978 Wall Street Journal story with the headline, "Can Old Strom Keep His Hold in Politics in the South?" In the story, Jim Perry quotes 75-year-old Senator Strom Thurmond as saying, "I thought I'd run one more time." So here we are, 20 years later, on a Thursday night. Perry is sitting here being honored as he heads into retirement. And where is still Senator Strom Thurmond? Out at a singles bar. Well, I must concede that this fellow Perry is pretty good at one thing, that is writing what you scribes call leads. You know, the top of the story that tricks people into reading the drivel below it. And, for example, in 1984, he helped write a story that began this way. Washington. When he was born, the flag that flew over the post office in his hometown had 16 stars. William Howard Taft was president, and windshields had just been introduced as standard equipment on automobiles. At the age of 73, Ronald Reagan is the oldest president this nation has ever had. Well, when you're a reporter as long as Perry has been, some of the things you write can, like your American sportcaster Marv Albert, come back and bite you. So, after conferring with his friends and colleagues, I have rewritten his story. He always needed a good editor.
Never got one.
As you can see, he's a bitter man. But the new lead goes like this. Elmira, New York. When he was born, the flag that flew over the state prison in his hometown had 48 stars. Calvin Coolidge was president, and Babe Ruth hit a record 60 home runs. After nearly a half a century as a journalist, Jim Perry is as young in spirit as the day he began. Cheerio.
So I was saying, now I want to tell you why the Board of Governors of the National Press Club felt he deserved it. Jim Perry has been a working reporter for 30 years. He's been an eyewitness to the political history of our time. He was with John Kennedy's entourage when he was assassinated in Dallas. He traveled with Lyndon Johnson to Vietnam. He has attended 18 national political conventions and has written 3 books about American politics and politicians and numerous books on other subjects. The selection committee called Jim Perry a towering figure of political reporting. His body of work reflects a purpose to tell readers in both clear and entertaining words what an election was all about and who the candidates really were. The beginning of one story from Flint, Michigan, Perry began his report with the following: "The planets are finally aligned for Jerry Brown." Again, in both clear and entertaining words, what an election was all about and who the candidates really were. One last one. I think it is a tribute to you tonight that so many of the people speaking, they have a lot of funny stories, but they all want to read your leads. And that is telling about a good writer. Dateline, New York, the moderator of the first debate between the Republican and Democratic candidates for governor turns to Hugh Carey, the Democratic incumbent, and asks what he admires most about his opponent, Perry Wsj. Quote, "I respect the fact that Mr. Wsj admits he was once indicted," unquote. I don't know how you cannot continue reading a story that begins like that. Between elections, Jim Perry worked his way across the Atlantic twice to join the Wall Street Journal's London bureau. Not content to cover the obvious, he wandered over the continent to bring journal readers memorable features on such subjects as the output of single malt distilleries in Scotland and the dying knowledge of gondola construction in Venice. The stocks of gondola companies went belly up after that story appeared. In the history of this award, and indeed of American journalism, our profession has been held suspect in the eyes of readers, viewers, and listeners. It was true in 1973 when Walter Cronkite appeared on this podium to accept the first Fourth Estate Award. We acknowledge our mistakes, he said, and our failings, but we need not apologize for telling the truth, nor for warmth and compassion, nor for editorial integrity. These are the qualities that Jim Perry and our previous honorees have exemplified. Perry tells colleagues that some of the work he did over the years was pure joy. In the process, he not only provided guidance to the voting public, but gave them something to brighten their day. The National Press Club is proud to honor James M. Perry tonight for his contribution to American journalism. Here's your Fourth Estate Award, and all you have to do is give a short speech.
I really can't deny any of that, but damn, I never asked anybody for a bottle of ketchup at lunch in my life. I want to thank President Salmon. I want to thank the Press Club's Board of Governors. And Don Larrabee down here, he's been doing this for 25 years, which truly in this kind of business is a Ripken-esque performance, I think. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I couldn't be more flattered or more pleased, though you've lied about me for now about an hour. I'd like to mention, I suppose I have to mention these characters. This one stranger, General Braddock. Where's General Braddock? Has he disappeared going back to the Monongahela, I imagine? He's actually my editor, Ron Schaefer, and he gives a lie to the notion that editors are never funny. He's a wonderfully funny man and also a really nice guy. And I'm delighted he showed up as a huge surprise. These other guys are no surprise at all. I've known him forever, it sometimes seems. Dickinson has always been the jarhead. I mean, I do have nicknames for people, you know. And he's the jarhead for reasons that are probably obvious to all of us here tonight. But also because he once served completely without distinction, as far as I can tell, in the United States Marine Corps. He hasn't made a whole lot of sense since that night he performed a triple backflip off a bar stool at the Sheridan Wayfair at a time we were both covering the New Hampshire primary for the old National Observer. Some of us who were there that night have thought about erecting a plaque to commemorate the event. The bartender gave him actually a 9.5. Hunt really is beyond nicknames. You should know that he grew up on Philadelphia's exclusive Main Line, and he went with all the other Biddles and Ingersolls to the Haverford School. His little friends spent their late afternoons playing squash, or maybe dropping by the nearby Marion Cricket Club to bowl a few overs. But our Albert, what did he do? I'll tell you what he did. He wrestled. Even then, when he was just a lad in a Brooks Brothers blue blazer and little gray flannel shorts, Albert knew that one day he would be appearing on Capital Gang, and so he girded his loins. The rest, of course, is history. Sort of. You know, I've heard Mary going on and on about the fact I've always called him Young Mary. Though, as you may have noticed, he hardly deserves it these days. Young Mary has been grousing for years. Then we worked together covering politics for the Journal. The bylines tended to be Perry and Mary, and never Mary and Perry. That is a base canard. I remember vividly the time Hunt told us both to write a story saying the Democratic National Convention would be the first multi-ballot affair in our time. Young Mary, I said, this looks like your kind of story. Write it. And I let him go first with the byline. Seriously, folks, as they say, these are old friends, and I'm delighted to be them once again. They are all exceptional reporters and writers, just as so many of the reporters I've worked with over the years have been. People often think of the Journal as just a business daily, but it has produced dozens of high-quality political reporters, going all the way back to Barney Kilgore himself. I worked with a whole bunch of them. The two Davids, Rogers and Shribman, Alan Otten, Mike Miller, Jim Large, Jerry Landauer, Brooks Jackson, Dennis Farney, Jeffrey Birnbaum, Hillary Stout, Mike Frisbee, Jill Abramson, and now holding the franchise and doing it very well, Jerry Seib and John Harwood. If I have had anything to do with helping any of these people, and I'm not convinced they needed very much help, then listening to these old lies and scurrilous stuff we've been listening to tonight is a sentence I suppose I'm willing to serve. This really is an extraordinary honor. I look at the names of those who have gone before, all 24 of them, and I actually do feel a surge, they won't believe it, but I do feel a surge of humility here. Honest to God.
Peggy, if you believe it.
I'm especially impressed by one name on this list, the legendary Vermont, Connecticut Royster, editor for many years of my newspaper, the Wall Street Journal. I can say as an absolute true fact that without Roy, I wouldn't be here tonight. Back in the 70s, Dow Jones management dispatched Roy to see if he couldn't turn the struggling National Observer around. The National Observer was always struggling, and he didn't do much about it. But at the time, I was the page one editor, thinking you had to be an editor to get ahead in journalism. My technique, Dickinson will attest to this, was pretty simple. I rewrote everything. So the whole front page read as if it had been written by the same person. As of course, indeed it had. It will not surprise you to learn that this was not a technique universally admired by my writers. Why in hell are you an editor, Roy asked. Well, I said, because, you know, to get ahead, you got to be an editor, etc., etc., etc. Nonsense, he said. And when Roy said things, he didn't pull punches. And he ordered me to start writing again. And I've been writing up articles for newspapers almost ever since. My friend Alan Otten tells the story of the time Royster came to Washington to attend a newspaper editors' meeting that included a press conference with President Kennedy. Kennedy called on Royster, clamoring to be recognized, to ask the first question. Predictably, of course, it was a zinger. And Kennedy barely managed to suppress his unhappiness in a rambling and unconvincing answer. When it was over, Otten later discovered, one of Kennedy's aides asked him why he'd called, for God's sake, why did you call on Royster to ask the first question? Because, Kennedy said, gritting those famous teeth, the little son of a bitch was the only one there whose name I could remember. Roy was a great man. I'm aware you don't receive this award for early career achievement. I've been writing for newspapers for not 50 years, as someone's just said, 47 years. And I'd like to talk a little bit, maybe, just for a few minutes, and I'll show you why in a minute, about how it used to be in this business during those years I worked for the old Philadelphia Bulletin. In its glory days back in the 60s and 70s when it was the largest evening paper in the country. Two of my old colleagues from the Bulletin are here tonight, Peter Benson and Harry Tolan. Together with a number of other old Bulletin hands, we've written a book. Well, we think we have, at least. It's a series of essays, really, about our old paper. Benson was the editor, and I see his name's the only one that appears on the front. Let me give it a shameless plug. Here it is, folks. Here it is, your first chance to see it. It's going on sale in a week or two, and it's called Nearly Everybody Read the Bulletin. So what was our old newsroom like? Well, of course, it was mostly male, largely Christian, and entirely white. It was sexist and racist. Then, of course, every newspaper in the country was sexist and racist. Today, newsrooms are much more diverse, and that's, of course, a tremendous change and a positive one. We weren't paid much in those days. I was made $90 a week. Today, reporters at big papers and make lots more, and some of them through TV and lecture contracts make what we really would have thought was an immense fortune back then. All of us of a certain age like to grumble, we grumble a lot, that there are no more characters in our business. Now, that isn't actually true. We have a young investigative reporter at the Journal whose files have obliterated his desk and all the space surrounding it. The files are mixed in with half-empty bags of cheese whizzes. He reminds me of a young reporter I knew years ago at the Journal. He was a heavy smoker, and the space around his desk was littered with old files, too. I don't remember the cheese whizzes, but there were packages from his mother back in Illinois. One day, he tossed a match on the floor and set his shoelaces on fire. His name was Robert Novak. One slight applause for Bob. We had lots of characters in the Bulletin, but they were different, and let me tell you just a little bit how they were different. One of my favorites was Ephraim Gorenstein, who had once been an usher in a downtown movie theater. When things were slow in the newsroom, he flogged watches he'd obtained from sources we chose not to ask about. Eph was a master of malapropisms, and the best of them were known as Ephisms. In a story about a storm that caused power outages, he reported to his rewrite man, poetically, that high Tennyson wires had been blown down. Another time, covering a ship collision in the Delaware River, he called in to say that people were philandering around in the water. The newsroom emptied, and within minutes. He once told me that a man had been shot in the thigh. The what, I asked? The thigh, damn it, he said. You know, just above the knee. I can't resist one more Eve story. This may be apocryphal, but I hope not. Early on, he worked in Camden, New Jersey, across the river from Philadelphia. And some of his colleagues thought they would play a trick on him, and they got the city desk to call him up and say, "Eve, you got to get on this story. There's a papal bull running amok down the Black Horse Pike." And he said, you know, the traffic is backed up, and they're worried about little babies being killed. And Eve leaped into his car and went chasing down the Black Horse Pike. And of course, they'd set up the police departments on the road. He'd go in the first town, he'd rush in the police department, and they said, "Where's the papal bull?" And the sergeant on duty would say, "Well, we missed him. He just went by." And Eve got down to the second town, and the same thing. And why, we just missed him. I mean, he's still, it's the fastest damn papal bull we ever saw. And so after about the third town down the road, he finally began to figure that this wasn't exactly kosher. And so he went back and screamed and yelled at his colleagues, and finally discovered it was a big joke. But there was a nice conclusion to that, because the Diocese of Camden and the Archdiocese of Philadelphia thought this was such a charming story that for years thereafter they gave all of their best stories exclusively to Eve Gorenstein. Reporters for big regional and national newspapers are fairly accused these days of being disconnected from ordinary working stiff. That was never a problem at the Bulletin, or I suppose most papers back then. As often as not, those of us who had gone to college, the new wave in journalism, were sitting right next to one, Eve or someone just like him. We chuckled a little at these reporters, these lifers who never wrote a story during their entire careers. Most of them couldn't type. But let me tell you something. These reporters knew things we didn't. They knew Philadelphia, for starters. They grew up in Philadelphia. They knew all the neighborhoods, and they knew most of the saloons. There's no room anymore for these people at big papers I'm talking about. We're all college educated now, and a fair number of us hold advanced degrees in the law or maybe Chinese studies. Those of us who had gone to college took over most of the major beats at the Bulletin, and we brought a different attitude to reporting. We were reformers at heart, not liberals so much, reformers. And we went along with the reform movement in Philadelphia in a very big way. The movement that gave Joe Clark as mayor and Dick Dilworth, my all-time favorite politician, as district attorney. We thought urban renewal was just the damnedest thing we'd ever seen. And we cheered as the bulldozers swept away block after city block. My stepbrother, William H. White, then a key editor of Fortune magazine, and soon to be the author of The Organization Man, suggested very quietly, very politely, well, he suggested, really, I was full of it, but he suggested maybe I should read what his protege, Jane Jacobs, was writing. I did, and I became a convert. She was absolutely right. City planners were destroying successful working-class neighborhoods in almost every old city in the country. Jane Jacobs had done something we had forgotten to do. She had abandoned her desk and gone out into the streets to see what was really happening. I don't suppose any of us, the young smart Alex who had taken over these beats, ever thought to ask Eve Gorenstein or Roland Moriarty or Harry Camp or any of the other old-timers what they thought about urban renewal. It's a lesson I've never forgotten. Most of us working in Washington spend too much time at our desks, I think. We need to get out, just like Jane Jacobs did, and see what's happening in parts of the country that may not share our concern for the daily minutiae of public affairs inside the Beltway. I've tried to do that. Some of these nice people have been kind enough to note some of this. I've tried to get out of town. It's not just because the restaurants may be better out there, because all those trips to San Francisco might something. Sometimes you really do have to cover stories with mobs of your competitors. But I've always felt, and I really mean this seriously, I've always felt that it's a lot more productive to be someplace all by yourself, breaking a little new ground. Now, we had media celebrities in the old days. We had Walter Lippmann, Edward R. Murrow, Walter Winchell, Dave Garroway and his monkey. We didn't have any at the Bulletin. We had this old-fashioned notion that we really shouldn't call the mayor Joe, and that we'd be stretching things if we asked Sam the DA for dinner. Of course, we probably couldn't afford to have Sam the DA for dinner on $90 a week. But at any rate, some of these media celebrities today, and when I say some, a very few, it's a small group, think of elected officials and public officials as their peers. Do we perform at the same level, I ask, innocently? I'm working on a book about the first war correspondents. They were all celebrities in their time, and some of them came home from the wars and cashed in big time, giving lectures and writing books. Now let me mention just a few of their names. Billy Russell, George W. Smalley, Frank Vistelli, Archibald Forbes, G.W. Stevens, G.A. Henty, and my favorite, James Aloysius McGann, George Wilkins Kendall. Have you ever heard of any of them? I doubt it. But you will recall the name of one of those early war correspondents, one of the best, Winston Churchill, a celebrity journalist by the time he was 25. That's not why we remember him today. We remember him because he made a career adjustment. He got himself elected to the House of Commons from the money he made on his lectures and books, and the rest really is history. Now, I don't say there's anything wrong with being a celebrity journalist. Enjoy it while it lasts. Why not? I simply argue that you should have earned that status. These war correspondents I'm talking about and writing about went through terrible danger. 7 of them were killed during Kitchener's Sudan campaign alone. The survivors had every right to come home and make money out of their lectures and books. They earned their fame, fleeting as it may have been. I think in a more peaceable time, that should be just as true today as it was then. You may not agree with Bob Novak or Al Hunt, or Jack Germond, or Judy Woodruff, or David Broder, or Charlie McDowell, or Mark Shields. But you need to realize that they've been there in the cockpit for a long time. I think that's important. I don't say it's a question of age, just because these guys are, you know, they're not all that young anymore. I don't say you have to be old to be good. Churchill, after all, was only 25. You simply need to know what you're talking about. And that usually comes from some experience. I was much taken by the reaction of Richard Harding Davis. Okay, we do remember him, I think. When he returned to the U.S. for some R&R early on in World War I, he said he was puzzled by the fact that many of his countrymen seemed pleased that war correspondents were having trouble covering the fighting because of the heavy hand of military censorship. So they would tell him, these people, "You didn't see a thing, did you?" But he was a great war reporter, a great reporter, and he had seen lots of things. And I quote him: German, French, Belgian, and English armies in the field, Belgium in ruins and flames, in Paris bombs falling from airships, and a city put to bed at 9 o'clock, battlefields covered with dead men. That, he said, was part of what I saw. What during the same 2 months did the man at home see? If he were lucky, he saw the Braves win the World Series or the Vernon Castles dance the foxtrot. Now that's my kind of celebrity journalist. He was a great man. Today some journalists, along with our camp followers, the quasi-journalists, the mock journalists, think they're entitled to become celebrities without doing very much to deserve it. They believe they are a lot more important than they really are. I think these people, and some of the rest of us too, myself included from time to time, tend to be pretentious, smug, greedy, and ultimately boring. These people, I think, need to be taken down a peg or two. Somebody out there should be making fun of us, and us, and them, and all of us, for being so damn pompous and presumptuous. Years ago, in A.J. Liebling's time, the New Yorker magazine punctured our egos in hilarious, wayward press columns. But now at the New Yorker, the kinds of people Liebling scorched seem to be running the place. Private Eye, a satirical magazine published in Britain, regularly makes fun of Britain's newspapers and TV networks. Its media column is headlined, "Street of Shame." And for years it was illustrated, and they've dropped it for some reason recently, but for years it was illustrated with a picture of a drunken old hack clutching a bottle of booze. Here in this country it might be best to illustrate such a column with the drawing of a well-dressed young man or woman clutching a bottle of Poland Springs. It helps, I think, it helped me anyway, to have some kind of home base, some place to go where people know you and won't put up with this pompous nonsense. I go back with my wife and children and grandchildren to upstate New York every summer, to a cottage in the Finger Lakes where my family has been summering since the turn of the century. It's a really humbling experience most days, talking to these old friends. They don't allow me to get a word in edgewise. I think the serious citizen needs to make distinctions between the good and the ugly. The serious citizen looking for serious reporting needs to know that even here in Washington, we still have hundreds of reporters doing their jobs every day, covering their beats with dedication and intelligence. I'm talking about the workhorses, the people the showboats read before they go on the air, to give their opinions on subjects they may not know very much about. Serious Americans, I think, should switch off those damn TVs more often and spend more time reading serious journalists. We do have lots of problems. I worry about them. I worry about editors who seem to be dazzled by glitz and glamour, involved in an unending pursuit of journalistic prizes. I worry these editors don't appreciate workhorse journalists the way their predecessors did. I worry, too, about another class of reporters, the literary journalists. We've always had a handful of them who could rise above the cliches of everyday journalism and write like novelists. Patient editors understood they were slower than the rest of us, but that the wait for their stories was almost always worthwhile. I'm not sure that young reporters and editors today appreciate this kind of writing or even recognize it. What finally happens to the news reported or the workhouse reporters and the features written by those literary masters in this new age of cyberspace journalism. My colleagues at the Journal will be first to tell you I'm no expert on the new technology, which may be the understatement of the year. But I have no doubt that we're heading away from the newspaper that flops on our doorstep every morning to a newspaper we somehow pull out of the space on our computer. Most newspapers already have such interactive editions, updating the news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If there is something evanescent about that newspaper on the doorstep, what about a newspaper that flashes on a screen in the blink of an eye? What happens then to stories carefully reported and researched and edited? What happens to stories lovingly written over and over again? A magazine reported not long ago about a visit made by one of its reporters to the headquarters of Bloomberg News Service, a flashy new outfit that supplies electronic news via cyberspace and that is giving Dow Jones fits. One of its units supplies news to TV and radio, and the reporter sitting at his computer station sends his or her stories on their way without benefit of editing. Just imagine that. 22-year-old journalists pouring out their hearts on the internet with no supervision of any kind. I suppose if, God forbid, Dow Jones were taken over by GE or Westinghouse or some other giant conglomerate, the new head sent to shape us up might think Bloomberg was onto something pretty damn interesting. Do you wonder then, do you really wonder, why some of us look back at Eve Gorenstein and the old Philadelphia Bulletin with a touch, just a touch, mind you, of lost innocence? Thanks again for bearing with me, and thanks to everyone concerned for making this wonderful night possible. Thanks ever so much.